It began in the winter of 1944, deep in the Ardennes forest. Snow fell in heavy silence, muffling the sound of engines hidden beneath the trees. Young soldiers, some barely 20, waited in frost-bitten trenches, their breath visible in the frozen air. They didn't know it yet, but within hours, the last great German offensive of the war would begin. Today we walk the same woods, but beneath the soil lie echoes of what they left behind. Helmets, letters, even shattered tanks still rusting under moss. This is the story of courage, desperation, and the final gamble of a dying empire, the Battle of the Bulge. Chapter 1: Shadows Before the Storm. Before the world caught fire, Europe was still pretending to be whole. The streets of Paris glowed with café lights. Children played in the parks of Warsaw. Trains ran on time in Berlin. But beneath that rhythm of daily life, something was shifting. An unease that no one could quite name, but everyone could feel. It was the late 1930s, and the world was holding its breath. Germany, humiliated by the Treaty of Versailles, was rising again, rebuilt by ambition, fueled by resentment. Adolf Hitler's voice filled radios across the Reich, promising renewal, power, and revenge. Ein Volk, ein Reich, ein Führer, he declared. One people, one empire, one leader. Many listened with hope, others with fear. By 1938, his armies marched into Austria without firing a shot. The world watched uneasy, yet silent. In London, Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain returned from Munich holding a piece of paper, a promise of peace. "I believe it is peace for our time," he said. The crowds cheered, but in the dim offices of the War Ministry, younger officers studied maps and knew better. They'd seen the build-up. The new tanks, the Luftwaffe's maneuvers, the factories working day and night under blackout curtains. Something was coming. Across the Channel, France fortified its borders with the Maginot Line, a wall of concrete, guns and steel meant to stop any invasion. It was an engineering marvel, but also a symbol of false security. Behind its massive walls, French soldiers smoked, played cards and joked that no German would ever dare attack again. Yet few noticed that the fortifications stopped at the Ardennes forest, a dense, hilly stretch of land long dismissed as impassable to tanks. That oversight would prove fatal. Meanwhile, in small towns across Belgium and Luxembourg, farmers went about their days unaware that their fields and valleys would soon be torn apart by artillery and armor. The Ardennes was peaceful, quiet, and cold, a place of fog, pine, and winding roads. It would soon become a battlefield soaked in fire. By 1944, the war had turned. The Allies had landed in Normandy, broken through at Saint-Lô, and were pushing steadily east toward Germany's heartland. The Reich was collapsing, but Hitler refused to surrender. He believed he could still divide the Allies, force them into a peace deal that would buy time. "We must strike like lightning," he told his generals. "We will drive them back into the sea." It sounded impossible, and yet, he ordered it anyway. Operation Wacht am Rhein, Watch on the Rhine, was born in secrecy. Nearly 300,000 German troops gathered under strict radio silence, hidden in the forests of the Ardennes. They camouflaged tanks under nets and built bridges in the dark. Even Allied intelligence missed the signs. General Eisenhower's headquarters believed Germany was finished, too weak to counterattack. The men on the front lines thought the same. Winter was setting in, and the soldiers dreamed only of going home by Christmas. In the villages behind the front, civilians sensed something strange. The night skies glowed faintly with the reflection of distant fires. Trains carrying troops passed through at odd hours. Local farmers heard engines in the woods. One old man later said, "The forest felt alive, like it was breathing." He wasn't wrong. December 15th, 1944. The eve of the offensive. German commanders met in frozen bunkers lit by lanterns. They studied maps of the Ardennes, the valleys, the roads, the choke points. Every detail mattered. Their goal: split the American lines, capture the port of Antwerp, and encircle the Allied armies. It was a desperate plan, but desperate men sometimes gamble with everything they have left. And so the stage was set. The world's greatest armies faced each other once more, though neither truly saw it coming. To the west, exhausted American divisions rested in the snow. To the east, the last remnants of Hitler's panzer forces waited in silence. Between them lay a forest, quiet, white, and ready to explode. In that calm before the storm, letters were written home. Soldiers thought of wives, sweethearts, and warm kitchens far away. Snowflakes drifted through the air, landing on helmets and rifle barrels. No one could know that within 24 hours, the Ardennes would erupt into chaos, and the final great battle of Europe would begin. Chapter 2: The Gathering Storm. By dawn on December 16, 1944, the Ardennes was wrapped in a heavy fog. It was so thick that Allied pilots were grounded, blind to the columns of German armor hidden beneath the trees. The quiet of the forest was broken only by the creak of ice-covered branches, until, at precisely 5:30 a.m., the first artillery shells began to fall. The sky flashed white, then red. Thousands of German guns opened fire across an 80-mile front, pounding American positions from Monschau to Echternach. Trees shattered like matchsticks. Earth trembled. Young infantrymen of the US 99th and 106th Divisions, many barely out of training, scrambled from their foxholes, their faces lit by the glow of explosions. It sounded like the end of the world, one private recalled. We didn't know what was coming, only that it was big. Operation Wacht am Rhein had begun. Under cover of fog and confusion, 3 German armies surged forward. The 6th Panzer Army under Sepp Dietrich, the 5th Panzer under Hasso von Manteuffel, and the 7th Army under Erich Brandenberger. Their orders were clear: drive west through the thinly held Ardennes, reach the Meuse River, and take Antwerp. Hitler believed the surprise would break the Allied line in two, forcing Britain and America to negotiate. It was a fantasy, but in that moment, his generals still obeyed. In the first hours, chaos reigned. American radio operators couldn't get clear signals through the weather. Lines were cut. Units were isolated. At the front, young lieutenants made decisions that would decide lives in seconds. "Hold your ground," came the order from headquarters. But many had no ground left to hold. The German spearheads advanced fast. Columns of Panther and Tiger tanks rumbled through the snow, their treads grinding frozen earth into white powder. The soldiers of the 1st SS Panzer Division, elite troops once feared across Europe, moved like ghosts through the mist. Some wore captured American uniforms, part of Otto Skorzeni's infamous Operation Greif, designed to sow confusion behind enemy lines. They switched road signs, misdirected traffic, and cut communication wires. Soon, rumors spread of spies everywhere. Trust broke down. Checkpoints began testing soldiers with questions only true Americans could answer. Who won the World Series? What's the capital of Illinois? In war, even language became a weapon. By midday, the small Belgian town of Lanzerath fell, then Losheimergraben. Then, as the fog thickened, the Germans reached the crossroads near Büllingen, where fuel dumps awaited. The Americans, low on supplies, were forced to retreat. A bitter wind carried the sound of engines deeper into the forest. Entire units vanished from the map, but resistance was not gone. Scattered across the line, pockets of Americans refused to yield. In a small crossroads village called Bastogne, elements of the 101st Airborne and the 10th Armored Division dug in. They didn't know it yet, but they were about to become legends. Back in Germany, propaganda called the offensive Die Letzte Hoffnung, the last hope. Hitler himself watched the reports from his headquarters in the Eifel Mountains. Every success was magnified, every delay explained away. But as the hours passed, he began to realize how fragile it all was. Fuel was running short. Roads were clogged. Supply lines stretched thin across the snow. The panzers moved slower than planned. And the Americans, though caught off guard, were adapting fast. In the midst of the offensive, a darker order was carried out. SS units under Joachim Peiper advanced toward the town of Malmedy. There, after capturing a group of American prisoners, they opened fire. Over 80 men were executed in the snow. News of the massacre spread rapidly, hardening Allied resolve. "No quarter," one survivor said. After that, no one surrendered. Meanwhile, in the Allied command center at Verdun, Eisenhower and his generals pored over maps, trying to understand what had just happened. "This is no local attack," said General Omar Bradley. "This is the big one." Patton, commanding the 3rd Army in the south, slammed his fist on the table. "Let's cut them off," he said. "Turn the whole damn army north." And within 48 hours, that's exactly what he did, pivoting 100,000 men in one of the fastest redeployments in military history. For the soldiers in the field, there was no grand strategy, only survival. The nights were brutal. Temperatures dropped below freezing. Frostbite claimed more men than bullets. Ammunition froze, engines stalled, and food ran out. Yet, in the darkness, small acts of humanity persisted. Medics shared rations. Locals opened cellars to shelter the wounded. One Belgian nurse later wrote, "The ground shook every hour, but we kept working. You couldn't think about dying, you just kept your hands moving." By Christmas Eve, the offensive had slowed. German tanks were running out of fuel, stranded on snowy roads. American artillery found its rhythm again. Air support returned as the weather cleared. From above, the frozen forests burned under Allied bombs. Hitler's gamble was unraveling. Still, he refused to stop. "We will hold Bastogne," he ordered. "We will crush them there." But the men he sent would find something very different waiting. An American division surrounded, outnumbered, but unbroken. The story of that stand would soon define the spirit of the entire war. The storm had gathered, and in its eye, in a small Belgian town, the fate of the Western Front would be decided. Chapter 3: The Siege of Bastogne. The snow fell harder that Christmas week than anyone could remember. Thick flakes drifted through the air like ash, covering foxholes and broken walls, silencing every sound but the distant rumble of artillery. In the center of the Belgian Ardennes, the town of Bastogne stood surrounded, 7 roads converging like spokes on a wheel, each one held by a handful of exhausted men who refused to give in. By December 19th, the 101st Airborne Division had arrived. They came straight from rest camps near Reims, still aching from Normandy and Holland. No winter gear, no heavy artillery, just rifles, grit and orders from General McAuliffe. "We hold Bastogne, no retreat." The men dug into the frozen earth, using their helmets to scrape trenches beneath the snow. The ground was so cold it tore the skin from their fingers. They used blankets as camouflage, covered rifles with socks, and waited. At dawn, the fog rolled in thick, hiding movement, but amplifying sound. The first German probing attacks came from the northeast. Panzer columns testing the perimeter. The defenders waited until they were close, then opened fire. The air filled with the clatter of machine guns and the deep thud of mortars. One soldier from Easy Company wrote later, "You didn't hear the shells land, just the sound of men yelling, snow exploding, and the smell of metal in the air. Civilians, trapped in their cellars, prayed for it to end." A local baker kept his family in the basement for 7 days, rationing bread baked before the siege began. "You could hear tanks outside," he said. The ground moved when they passed. Above him, paratroopers crouched behind door frames, firing through shattered windows. Every building became a fortress, every street a killing ground. Then came the demand for surrender. On December 22nd, 2 German officers approached under a white flag, bearing a letter for McAuliffe. They offered honorable terms if the Americans laid down their arms, and promised total destruction if they did not. McAuliffe, weary and cold, read the note and laughed. His reply was just one word: nuts. It was typed, sealed, and sent back through the lines. The men in Bastogne never forgot it. "That word carried us," one sergeant later said. "It was defiance you could feel." The next day the bombardment began. German artillery rained down on Bastogne in waves, flattening homes and turning the main square into a cratered wasteland. The 502nd Parachute Infantry held the northern edge, where tanks tried to break through. They fought from tree line to tree line, retreating only when they had to, then counterattacking at night. Ammunition ran low. Medics melted snow for water. Field hospitals overflowed. In a makeshift ward inside a church, nurses worked by candlelight while shells whistled overhead. One nurse later said, "You stopped flinching. The sound was constant. You only noticed when it stopped." In the air above, the skies finally cleared on Christmas Eve. The men looked up and saw it, the silver wings of C-47 transport planes cutting through the clouds. Parachutes blossomed like white flowers, carrying crates of food, ammunition, and medical supplies. Some men cried. That sound, one recalled, was the sound of life coming back. But even as hope returned, the siege tightened. German tanks massed on the southern flank near Marvy. At dawn, they advanced through the mist, their cannon flashes lighting up the fog. The Americans held their fire until the panzers were within 50 yards, then unleashed everything they had. Bazookas, grenades, even captured Panzerfaust ripped through the armor. The battle raged for hours. When the smoke cleared, Marvy still stood, barely. The snow was blackened, the smell of oil thick in the air. By December 26th, the defenders were near their limit. Cold, hungry, and outnumbered, they clung to the ruins of a town that refused to die. Then from the south came the faint sound of engines, American tanks. Patton's Third Army had broken through. At 4:50 p.m., The 1st Sherman tank of the 4th Armored Division rolled into Bastogne. The men cheered, wept, and waved from foxholes. "We made it," one wrote in his journal. "We're still here." But victory came at a price. Hundreds lay frozen where they fell, still clutching their rifles. Civilians emerged from cellars to find their homes gone, their towns scarred beyond recognition. The snow that had once been white was now grey, stained with oil and blood. McAuliffe's men had held for 7 days, against tanks, hunger, and the coldest winter Europe had seen in decades. They didn't win by numbers. They won by endurance. As night fell, Patton himself arrived briefly in Bastogne. He looked over the ruins, the burned-out armour, the men still standing guard in the snow. He turned to an aide and said quietly, "A great story. Someday they'll tell it right." Then he left for the next fight. The siege was over. But the Battle of the Bulge, the largest and bloodiest engagement the US Army would ever fight, was far from done. Across the Ardennes, forests still burned, villages still fell. And though the German advance had been stopped, their retreat would be fierce and costly. The snow would hide the dead until spring. The war's end was coming, but not yet. Chapter 4: The Winter of Reckoning. When the guns finally quieted in early January 1945, the Ardennes looked less like a forest and more like a graveyard. The snow was blackened with soot, scattered with burnt-out armour and shattered trees. Here and there, boots still stuck out of the drifts, the dead buried where they fell. The silence was strange, almost cruel after weeks of thunder. For the survivors, it felt like waking from a nightmare they weren't sure had really ended. In Bastogne, the men of the 101st Airborne emerged from foxholes, stiff and hollow-eyed. Their faces were gaunt, lips cracked from the cold. They didn't talk much. Some went searching for friends they hadn't seen since the first shelling. Others just stood, staring at the frozen landscape that had nearly consumed them. "We were alive," one soldier wrote, "but we weren't the same." The townspeople came out next. Families who'd spent weeks in cellars stepped into daylight to find a world unrecognizable. Houses were nothing but shells. The church where nurses had worked by candlelight was now half rubble. Yet somehow life began again. A woman brushed snow from the threshold of her destroyed bakery and lit a fire. Children carried buckets of melted snow to soldiers who hadn't had clean water in days. Out of ruin came small, stubborn acts of survival. The battle had cost the Allies over 80,000 casualties. For Germany, even more, men and machines they could never replace. Hitler's last great gamble had failed. His armies were broken, his fuel reserves gone, his generals weary and disillusioned. Still, the war dragged on. The Wehrmacht fell back toward the Rhine, and the Allies followed, one frozen step at a time. In the hospitals behind the lines, the wounded filled every bed, limbs wrapped in bandages, faces burned and blackened from frostbite. The medics worked without rest. Some sang to keep from collapsing. One nurse remembered a soldier who woke from surgery and whispered, "Did we win?" She told him yes. He smiled and slipped away. Those small moments of mercy, a hand held, a lie told for comfort, became the only things that kept people human. As January thawed into February, the Ardennes began to breathe again. Snow melted, revealing wrecks rusting in the mud, bodies being recovered one by one. Graves were marked with helmets and wooden crosses. Chaplains moved from site to site, reading the same brief words over endless names. "We commit them to the earth until peace returns." For many, peace still felt a long way off. Meanwhile, reports of atrocities surfaced: Malmedy, Wereth, countless unnamed villages. The brutality of the winter offensive had stripped away whatever illusions remained about chivalry and war. Prisoners shot in the snow, civilians caught in the crossfire. There was no romance left in battle, only exhaustion and the weight of what had been done. "We stopped thinking of them as soldiers," one GI said of the enemy. "They were just men trying not to die, same as us." Letters home carried both pride and guilt. "Mom, I'm fine," one young man wrote. "But tell Dad, I don't think I'll ever feel warm again." For many veterans, that chill never left. The Ardennes followed them for the rest of their lives, in dreams, in the smell of diesel, in the quiet of falling snow. Back in Germany, the truth began to dawn even within the Reich itself. Propaganda broadcasts still spoke of counteroffensives and miracle weapons, but few believed them anymore. Trains returned from the west half empty. Villagers saw their sons come home wounded or not at all. Mothers stood on platforms, waiting for names that never came. The defeat at the Bulge wasn't just military, it was psychological. The empire that once promised 1,000 years was now running on borrowed weeks. For the Allies, Bastogne became a symbol, not of glory but of endurance, a reminder that courage isn't the absence of fear, it's the decision to keep going anyway. Nuts became a story told and retold, but behind that one word lay hunger, cold, and sacrifice beyond measure. The men of the 101st, the tankers of Patton's Third Army, the medics and civilians who held the line, they hadn't just defended a town, they'd proven that even when surrounded, even when frozen and half-starved, they could stand firm. As the front moved east, soldiers began to see spring's first signs, thawing rivers, green shoots breaking through mud, birds returning to the trees. For a moment, it felt like hope, yet the war's end would bring new horrors, the discovery of the camps, the reckoning with what humanity had allowed to happen. In that sense, Bastogne wasn't the end of the story. It was the last deep breath before the truth of the war was laid bare. Still, in those months after the battle, amid the wreckage and silence, the Ardennes began to heal. Slowly, quietly. Locals rebuilt their homes brick by brick. Soldiers were sent home or forward to the next fight. And in the evenings, when the wind passed through the bare trees, some swore it still carried faint echoes of the guns, a reminder of the winter when the world nearly froze and men refused to yield. The war would end soon, but for those who lived through the Bulge, peace would never sound as loud as silence. Chapter 5. Echoes of the Frozen Front. The Ardennes stands quiet now. The roads are paved, the forests thick with green again, and the scars of that brutal winter lie buried beneath moss and soil. But every so often, a hiker or a farmer still uncovers something. A rusted helmet, a dog tag, a bullet flattened by impact. Each one tells a story, long silent but not forgotten. The Battle of the Bulge ended the Nazi dream of recovery, but it also marked a turning point in how the world remembered war itself. When the survivors came home, they didn't speak much. Some locked their memories away, unwilling to revisit the cold, the hunger, the faces they left behind. Others spoke only in fragments, of laughter around a fire made from burning fence posts, of comrades lost in snow, of the strange stillness after the shooting stopped. You could hear your own heart, one veteran said. That's how you knew you were still alive. They were young men turned old before their time, carrying with them a piece of the forest that no one else could see. In the years after, historians debated the tactics and the strategy, the brilliance of the Allied response, the desperation of the German plan. But for those who were there, it was simpler. It was about endurance, about holding when holding felt impossible, about the sound of C-47s overhead dropping hope through clouds of smoke, about the letter from McAuliffe that said nuts, a single word that summed up the stubborn defiance of men who refused to surrender even when the world told them they should. Across Belgium and Luxembourg, memorials began to rise. Modest at first, a plaque here, a stone cross there, built not by governments, but by townspeople who had lived through the siege. They remembered the soldiers who shared their last rations, who carried their children from burning houses, who fought not for conquest, but for one another. They came as strangers, one woman said at the dedication of a monument in Bastogne, but they left as part of us. In America, the veterans returned to farms, factories, and schools. They married, raised families, and rarely spoke of the cold. Yet, every December, some of them gathered again, in VFW halls, in Bastogne's main square, or quietly in their living rooms, to raise a glass to absent friends. Their laughter carried a tremor, their silences a weight. They were bound by something unspoken, a memory of shared endurance that time could not thaw. For Germany, the defeat at the Bulge was the final unraveling. The Reich's last reserves of armor and manpower had been spent. From that moment on, the war was only retreat, collapse, and surrender. But in the ashes, a generation of Germans would grow up to face the truth their fathers could not. That the war's cost was not measured in territory, but in humanity lost. Reconciliation, slow and painful, began with remembrance. The same remembrance that still draws veterans' families together each winter in those quiet, snow-covered woods. Today, the Ardennes feels peaceful, almost sacred. The same hills that once echoed with cannon fire now ring with birdsong. The same roads once choked with tanks are lined with markers bearing names: Bastogne, Houffalize, St. Vith. Tourists visit the museums, walk the preserved foxholes, touch the cold metal of restored Shermans. But if you listen closely, the forest still holds its breath. It knows what happened here. The trees that once splintered under shrapnel still stand, older now, but not entirely healed. Every war leaves behind ghosts, not the kind that haunt, but the kind that remind. They whisper through the generations, asking not for glory, but for memory. The Battle of the Bulge taught the world that even in the darkest winter, resolve can endure. It showed that courage isn't loud, and victory doesn't always look like triumph. Sometimes it looks like a frozen soldier sharing his last match. Sometimes it's a medic staying behind so others can run. Sometimes it's a simple answer to impossible odds. Nuts. 80 years later, historians still debate tactics and command decisions, but those details fade against the weight of human endurance. The men of the Ardennes didn't fight for medals. They fought to hold the line, not just a military front, but a moral one. They fought so the world could move forward, even as they stood still in the snow. As the sun sets over the Ardennes today, light filters through the pines, catching the outlines of old trenches and rusted relics. It's quiet now, the kind of quiet earned only by great suffering. Visitors pause, remove their hats, and listen. Somewhere in that stillness, the echo of 1944 lingers, faint, steady, eternal, because history never truly ends. It waits in the silence of the forests, in the snow that falls each winter, reminding us that peace, once bought, must never be taken for granted.